Welcome back to Haunted and Historic Australia for another episode of Criminals, Cutthroats and Convicts. In this episode, we learn the tale of poor Looney McDougall. Looney McDougall was a shepherd, and he was of the age of 23. He wasn't a smart man. We don't even know what his real name was. From newspapers back at the time, we understand his name to be possibly George or John. But he was known around the area of Carcoar as simply Looney. Looney was a tall man, freckly, with sandy blonde hair. Originally from Sydney and possibly born there too, he came up to the Carcoar area about 3 years before. It seems he may have been a little bit slower off the mark. He wasn't as bright as others, and although he wasn't as bright, he still kept up with everybody. And he was a shepherd, so he made a living fair. Looney was the kind of guy that talked to everybody. He was a happy-go-lucky kind of person, and his favourite pastime seemed to be earning his money, spending time with the sheep, and having a yarn down at the local drinking hole and filling his belly with beer. Now, we know that he did have family in Sydney, because on the fateful night that poor Looney encountered his end, he wrote a letter to his poor ma in Sydney and enclosed a £1 note that he was going to mail her. Possibly he sent money home to Sydney all the time for his old ma. He must have come up this way in search of where all the action was happening, which around the goldfields near Bathurst he found his means of payment as a shepherd. Looney, on this fateful night, entered the drinking hole, a simple hut not far from the Rothery's Run, where he worked for William Rothery, and he also lived there with few others. It was a shame he'd chosen that night to enter this particular hut, as there was another man there, whose real name was Thomas, but he was known to everybody as James. He also worked for William Rothery and stayed at the same place as Looney. Wasn't a very nice man, out for whatever he could get. Now Looney was observed that night, not just by the establishment in ordering his beer, but a 13-year-old boy kept watch, as he must have seen the £1 note that he pulled out of his pocket and put into a letter. He also observed Looney leaving, and another man following him out, calling after him, saying he'll join him on his way to Carcoar. They left the hut and made their way toward Carcoar. Along the way, unfortunately for Looney, John Wood whacked him, took every possession that he had on his person, including the £1 note in the letter to his poor ma that she'd never receive, and dug a shallow grave for poor Looney, dumped his body in it, covered it up, and went on his way. But Looney's tale doesn't end there, for in the afterlife, Looney decides he's going to be a companion still of James Wood, and decides also that he would follow him to the ends of the earth. James possibly had murdered before, but this murder was different. He'd murdered Looney McCall, and Looney wasn't going to let him get away with it. This awful murder of innocent Looney had somehow twisted the fate and the soul of Looney to James Wood forever. James tried everything he could to get away from Looney, to escape that cursed voice, that laugh, that chuckle. He didn't much like Looney in the flesh, and now he's got his ghost haunting him everywhere he goes. In his dreams, in his reality, everywhere he looked, Looney. He was there, laughing, carrying on, having a yarn, just as he'd done in his life. James Wood started to go a little mad. One night, after he drowned his sorrows and tried to drown Looney out, he decided he was going to rob the Mudgee shop. However, he was caught in the act and thrown into Mudgee jail for 6 months. Now, of course, Looney joined him. Every moment of his time in this jail, Looney was there, quite happily chatting away to him. There was nowhere that James could go where Looney wouldn't follow him. Not even jail. Looney was quite happy to sit there and chat. Now, in the meantime, Looney's body was still buried back in Karkor, and the Australian animals were trying to get him out, it seems. It was noticed that Looney was missing on the morning after his fateful event. The sheep he was meant to be monitoring were wandering all over the yard. They knew something had happened. He was even owed money. So why would Looney just disappear? The town began to wonder what had happened to Looney. The crows were circling one day, and the replacement shepherd for Looney noticed this. But as he was a bit of a lazy fella, he never did anything about it, and also subsequently must have been lazy in his monitoring of the sheep because he was fired. The next replacement shepherd was actually a prospector, and the instincts of a gold hunter stuck with him, and he thought he may, as well as being a shepherd, see if he could not find gold on the property as well. He delved into the woods around where he was doing his shepherding, and upon looking for areas he could fossick in, came upon Looney's skull, a skull bobbing up from the dirt. Now it is assumed that the Australian animals had been digging around where Looney had been buried in his shallow grave, and upon looking at Looney's skeleton, he was positioned in such a fashion that it looked as though his skeleton was trying to get out of the grave, haunched up on his elbows and his head protruding from the dirt. And that's how the prospecting shepherd found him. Instantly a trooper came to do some more investigation. He asked around at the watering hole and spoke to the 13-year-old lad who'd noticed Looney McDougall on the night he went missing. They exhumed the skeleton and went over the body. The doctor that looked over the skeleton of Looney was trying to work out whether it actually was Looney or not. He said that the skull was that of a man of at least 45 years. Another doctor was called in to help. It was a Dr. McKinney of Bathurst. He looked at the skeleton and to the skull, and he said the depressions on the skull looked as though it would be of someone with limited mental development, and the townsfolk knew of Looney and his antics. They knew he wasn't the sharpest tool in the shed, so to speak. The doctor even said, what colour hair did Looney have? And they said it was a sandy colour, blonde. They went back to the grave site and tried to collect as much evidence of hair strands that they could. Every strand they found in that grave was of a sandy colour. They knew it was Looney. It was official. There was also a mention of James Wood, who had been in the town for a certain amount of time, and he'd been missing as well. So he'd also been thought of as being the skeleton in the grave, until it was definitely decided it was Looney. And then they started to wonder, where had James Wood gone? Around the same time that Looney was apparently murdered. It must have reached the 13-year-old lad, because he was sure that night he heard someone say the name Wood. The trooper now suspected that John Wood must have something to do with it, and did a bit of asking around in various towns along the way had they noticed or seen John Wood. Nobody had seen him for months, and that was because he was still in the jail at Mudgee, and they didn't think to check the jails in those days. At this particular time, around the 1860s, newspapers really only spoke of news of their local area, unless it was the big cities. So at this point, Woods hadn't known that the body of Looney had been found, or that he was the main suspect and the troopers were looking for him. James did his 6 months and was finally freed from Mudgee Jail. Now at this point, you would assume that James would head in the opposite direction of Looney's grave, not go back to Karkor, but as if in a trance or some magnetic pull, he was drawn back to the very place of Looney's demise. Now the troopers had all but given up on finding James Wood. They'd been chasing this man for 6 months and nobody had heard of him. They assumed he'd just left. And at this time, there were other things going on, such as many of the bushrangers creating work for them. So the case was almost thrown away. But Looney wouldn't let that happen now, would he? It seemed the only person looking into the case, or pushing the case, was Looney himself. He hadn't left James' side, and he was joining him on his trip back to Carcoar. If only these troopers had known that had they waited by Looney's grave, that James would happen to stroll by it once more, full of regret and haunted by Looney. He could almost but give himself up. One night, the troopers Sutherland and Sanderson had been out chasing possums that had possibly been reported as creating havoc around people's homes. They'd ventured out into the ranges, chasing this damned possum, and it brought them almost to the spot of where Looney was buried. While they were chasing possums, they noticed a light flicker around the vicinity of where McDougall was found. One of the men said he was going to check it out. They were about 150 yards from the spot that they were aiming at, and they heard a breaking stick. They knew that it was coming from ahead of them, where that light flicker was. Originally they thought it may have been a shooting star, but they were going to check it out anyway. And once they heard the breaking stick, they assumed it may have been an animal, perhaps. They proceeded with caution. As they got closer, they could see the outline of a man sitting down, and it appeared he was sitting down with his head nodded in a sleep upon the grave they dug Looney out of. What a strange happening. They assumed he must have had something to do with the burial. "Is your name James Wood?" James flatly denied it, and the trooper said, "Let your name be as you will. You're coming with us. We'll soon find out what you're called." "Do you know this man?" he queried his other trooper. "Not by name," the other trooper said, "but I now remember him as a man who was not seen on Carra Rocks the night after a man was killed and robbed, and he went missing on Braidwood Field very shortly after Jack Launton was found at the foot of his own claim, dead. Looks funny, don't you think?" And others around the community popped in to see this so-called murderer of Looney. Wood's trial began in Bathurst, and there was little that they could say in his defence. The judge decided that he shall hang in Bathurst Jail on June the 7th, 1865. Woods endured Looney's spirit right up until his very end, and then nothing. Quiet. He was finally rid of Looney's ghost. Or was he? Perhaps he'd become a ghost himself and walked the lonely highway between Carcoar and Mudgee. There is a lot we don't know about the other side. Perhaps those who are haunted in life are also haunted in death. It may even be that Looney still walks with John between the roads of Carcoar and Mudgee. Could he ever rid himself of Looney? Who knows? We hope you enjoyed that episode on the ghost of Looney McDougall. Stay tuned for more ghostly upcoming episodes. Don't forget to like, subscribe, share and comment, and hit that notification bell so you're aware when we're posting more videos.